Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 31st of August. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, Douglas Murray asks in his column why museums seem so desperate to give up their collections. George Osborne wants to send the Elgin marbles back to Greece. Could the Benin bronzes be next? He'll join me. Is it going to be India's century? James Heale writes this week's cover piece about how Rishi Sunak wants to bind Britain to the country with the biggest population in the world. James will join me with Ravi Agrawal. Sunak has had a mini reshuffle this week to replace Ben Wallace. His party, though, is still 20 points behind in the polls. Should he be taking more risks to win over the public? Katy Balls will be on the show. Swallow Braverman this week told police that they need to investigate every crime. Why isn't this happening already? I'll speak to Ian Acheson. And finally, Kate Andrews says Brits don't go to the doctor enough. She'll join me. Before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Spectator TV is picking up thousands of new subscribers every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, Douglas Murray writes about George Osborne's plan to return the Elgin marbles to Greece in this week's magazine. Why is it that more and more museum directors seem to hate the collections they're looking after? Douglas joins me now. Douglas, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. You write in the magazine this week about a particular affliction that seems to affect Tories in middle age and how you always suspected George Osborne was going to succumb to it. So can you tell us a bit about that, please, and why you think George Osborne was a prime candidate for a midlife crisis?
Yes, it's a fascinating part of political anthropology that there is a type of conservative, particularly conservative male, it has to be said, who in middle age has a sort of breakdown about their beliefs and, see also Matt Hancock, and usually this expresses itself in a loss of belief in the things that they have argued for hitherto, and usually the adoption of a right-on cause as they see it. Ordinarily, it manifests in requests for the legalization of marijuana or drugs of some kind. And that's the most common one. Crispin Blunt, perhaps, is a good example as well. I think the explanation is that a certain type of conservative has been so used to espousing relatively unpopular or uncool opinions that they hope that if they do something sort of grand in middle age, it'll make up for it and wash all of these sins away. I say that George Osborne has long been a prime candidate for this. George Osborne, of course, gets all of the attacks and brickbats of the left, I think rather unfairly. I mean, they literally accuse him of being a murderer, of killing people through austerity, which, of course, was not really austerity at all. But anyway, he suffered a lot of unpopularity, perhaps culminating in that famous boo in the stadium in the London Olympics, which must have been very upsetting to him. But I predicted that he would be the sort of conservative who would end up having a midlife crisis, and he would have to espouse some right-on cause. And the moment that he took over as chairman of the trustees of the British Museum, I thought, I see this one coming.
He's arranged, so this is manifested, he's arranged a loan for the Elgin marbles. Can you tell us a bit about that? Why is it such a bad deal, for example, to give the Greeks the Elgin marbles for a little while?
Well, I mean, first of all, as I say, it's a totally predictable thing. If you become chair of the trustees of the British Museum and you're conservative, you will feel a disproportionate desire to send the Elgin marble to Greece. It's so tempting as this wonderful demonstration of right honoring. And of course, George Osborne, we've learned, has been negotiating this return. I say that in the magazine, I think it's a rather unwise deal, a deal that's so cat-handed, in fact, so far as we know, that it could have been negotiated by an Austin Powers villain. It's apparently a deal that the British Museum sends the marbles to Athens, and in return, Athens sends some treasures that have never before been seen in the UK. That's very nice of them, I'm sure, but I would have thought that the likelihood of the marbles being returned is exceptionally small, as Noel Malcolm of All Souls, among others, has said this week. It would only require one Greek citizen to go to court and insist that marbles must not be returned to the UK, and that would hold it up on its own, and goodness knows that person might even find the Greek courts are slightly sympathetic to their case. So it isn't a very wise a deal, it seems to me. And although people deny it, there's just no doubt that when it comes to this alleged returning of treasures, you start off with one and you go straight on to the others. The Benin bronzes have long been, or at least for some years, have been regarded as sort of stolen loot, which most of them are not. And the Obar of Benin has been getting more press recently than at any time since the late 19th century. And the Benin bronzes will, of course, be next. And then you just go down the list. There's calls from Egypt for the Rosetta Stone to be sent there. It just won't end. And as I say, it's a demonstration of a type of weakness, but a type of weakness that really only the Tory male in midlife is capable of.
And you mentioned in the piece as well, Douglas, that all this seems to be going on, this sort of obsession with giving the marbles back and decolonising the museum comes at a time when the British Museum is facing a bit of a crisis in terms of the theft of missing items. Do you think they've been distracted, essentially, from their main functions?
Yes, that's right. Almost 2,000 artefacts appear to have been stolen from the British Museum under the noses of the director and trustees. It's extraordinary. A member of staff has been fired, and the museum's director has resigned. But we've subsequently learned that even 2 years ago, a Danish expert wrote to the British Museum saying that artifacts from the British Museum were finding their way onto the market, even being put on eBay. And so, having been alerted to this 2 years ago, the British Museum appears not to have acted at all and thought that actually everything was fine. I wonder if this isn't the time to extend one of my own laws. I might histrionically call it Murray's Law, which is this: in the same way that we now know that when an energy company goes on about how green they are, we know that they're polluters. And in the same way that we now know that when a bank goes sort of huge on BLM or something, they're actually corrupt, or that when a financial services firm decides to go huge on ESG, DEI, and all the other stuff, it's because they're not giving good returns to their customers. We should, I think, start to assume that when museums like the British Museum end up obsessing over their collection as if they're stolen goods, actually they are not in charge of the collection in the way they should be. Actually, they are not protecting and preserving the collection, which is, after all, their sole job. I think we should expect, in such cases, the moment that a museum director or curator starts talking about getting rid of the collection as if it's a set of hot stolen goods off the back of a truck, we should assume that they actually do not have the ability to do the basics of looking after the core of the collection.
Yeah, I mean, see, you mentioned the museum director there who's recently resigned. I mean, he was behind moving the bust of Hans Sloane from a different part of the museum because of his links to the slave trade. I mean, do you ever get the sense of why do these people in particular take these jobs if they resent their collections so much?
You're so right. I mean, exactly. The director who did that, of course, totally tokenistic and pointless and actually rather insulting gestures like the movement of the bust become a sort of cover, as I say, for sort of inadequacies at best elsewhere. I think you can see this in collection after collection. I've written about this in the magazine before. Most obvious example is the Wellcome Trust. But I would suggest that people should do a serious audit on the governance of Tate Britain, among others. I've written about this in the magazine before, but Tate Britain is run by people who seem to hate the collection in their care and keep insulting the artists whose work they are meant to be preserving for future generations. Most notably, Tate Britain has closed the Rex Whistler mural room, insulted Rex Whistler, who died fighting the Nazis, also insulted Stanley Spencer and degraded him as some kind of racist. I think that all of the people in charge of the collection of Tate Britain should be fired. I think they have no right to be in charge of a great national collection. But that's the difference that seems to exist today. There was a period where to be on a board like that of Tate Britain was to know that you had a guardianship for a short time of one of the great collections in the country and indeed in the world. It takes a certain type of extraordinary, what would you call it? Not just hubris, but a kind of arrogance to think, to dare to think that your job is not to preserve the collection, but to stand in judgment over it, and to stand in judgment over how it was put together, and who contributed to it, and who the artists are, and whether or not they live up to your glorious self. To hell with these people. They have no right to be in charge of our great collections. Many of them are clearly, demonstrably unfit for the task. And I, at any rate, would like to see them replaced by people who actually venerate the collections and regard it as being an honour, as it is, to be in charge of such treasures.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Douglas.
It's a great pleasure.
Next, James Heale writes in the magazine this week about Rishi Sunak's plan to get close to India. But does India want closer ties with Britain? James joins me now with Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy magazine. James and Ravi, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. James, you write in the cover piece this week that when Rishi Sunak goes to India next week for the G20, goes to New Delhi, it's going to be quite a moment. Can you tell us why and a bit of the background here?
Well, of course, yes. I mean, I think that it will be a big moment for the history of Anglo-Indian relations, stretching back 4 centuries. First time we've had a Prime Minister of Asian heritage going over and sort of meeting 2 Hindu heads of government. And it's going to be a really big moment, I think, because this is going to be, I think, a future cornerstone of Britain's post-Brexit policy. Under Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, I think there was often a case, perhaps, that trade deals were pursued, for the moment of proving that Britain could sign these deals and for their own sake. But I think this is much more under Rishi Sunak. It's perhaps seen much more as part of a strategy of tilting to the Indo-Pacific and really trying to encourage those economic ties at the same time as building a security relationship as well. And so I think that along with the G20, a moment when India is hoping to showcase itself to the world, there's also going to be lots of talks behind the scenes going on. We've had about 12, I think, ministerial visits or so this past 12 months. And that really shows how much emphasis Britain is putting at a ministerial level on fostering these ties. And as I write in the piece, India is going to be one of the 2 biggest economies by 2050 on current trends, and it's going to be a relationship, I think, that's only going to seem more and more important in the future decades to come.
Ravi, James mentions there that part of Sunak's strategy is about sort of hitching Britain to the wagon of what could be like the next global economic superpower. I mean, do you agree with that strategy? Do you think now is the right time to try and ally with India?
I think it is. I mean, as long as one keeps in mind that India is a longer-term bet, of all the things that seem dynamic about India, whether it is its young population, whether it's rising GDP, whether it's the increased consumption capacity of the Indian middle class, all of those things are based on projections in the future and India continuing its current growth rate. And so it's a longer-term ploy. I don't think anyone who tries to sort of milk a relationship with India in the short term is going to succeed, whether you're a company or a country. But in as much as, this lays some of the groundwork for a future post-Brexit British sort of global trade agenda, it only makes sense to hitch one's wagon to India for the longer term.
And James, the free trade deal there that's been mentioned, I mean, for Britain, how much of this is economic or how much of it is just about building ties, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both, really. I think that clearly it was a big economic disruptor to leave the European Union 7 years ago. And so what this is about really is trying to find those new markets and new developments. And obviously, I think you look at the Foreign Office, it's couched a lot of this stuff in demographic terms. So looking to the future, as Ravi says, and sort of betting on the fact that by all metrics, it seems Indo-Pacific is going to be the key region for growth in both people and economics as well in the future. But also, I think it's starting to lay the groundwork for future terms. I think, talking to people, in and around the Foreign Office, there's perhaps been a sense that India hasn't really loomed over the past couple of decades, perhaps in the foremost of Britain's strategy as perhaps it could or should have been. And now it's sort of trying to kind of put some of that right, and a recognition that India has a tradition of on trade of being, it was quite protectionist for the first 4 decades after independence. That sort of changed from the 1990s. But it's a country where there haven't been that many great trade deals, really deep trade deals struck. And so this is a sort of attempt to try and move some of that. And I think really at the strategic level is the hope is that India could certainly be developed more as a long-term ally, given its tradition, as I say, of protectionism and non-aligned movement during the Cold War as well.
Ravi, what do you get the senses of India's perspective on this? I mean, it's becoming quite important in the UK, but is it kind of a sideshow in India, or do you think they do want better relations with Britain?
I think it's a bit of both. I think, as James was just mentioning, India is still fairly protectionist. India doesn't see itself as non-aligned anymore, but it tries to use the phrase strategic autonomy instead. It has a very transactional foreign policy. It has a transactional trade policy. It likes to pick and choose allies in sort of an a la carte manner, if you kind of imagine the world map as a giant buffet. And that's sort of how India seeks to conduct its foreign policy now, especially under Prime Minister Modi. And one has to imagine that he will remain in power after next year's elections as well. So this is an enduring foreign policy as well. But in terms of importance, I do get the sense that this visit is much more important for the United Kingdom than it is for India. I think India, of course, is seeing the G20 summit as its moment in the sun. It is seeing its own position as being enhanced on the global stage, as a voice of the global South. It's very keen to try and project itself as a leader among developing countries. And I think that really is the most important thing for New Delhi this month and in several months to come, whether it's climate change negotiations, whether it's asking for more compensation payments at COP28 in Dubai later this year, whether it is striking separate deals with the United States or other countries on specific tech or defense issues. India is very much picking and choosing how it wants to make friends anywhere in the world. And I think the UK is part of that agenda. One other key thing that has changed over the last few years is China. I think India has really reoriented its foreign policy from thinking less about Pakistan these days and much more about China, whether it is conducting trade with China, whether it's border issues, whether it's diversifying its military and defense ties. It is currently diversifying away from Russia, more towards Western countries, France and the US specifically. But this is where the UK fits in as well, because as the UK reorients itself away from China, which, by the way, was a sticking point for India 5 or 6 years ago, but as the UK becomes less likely to want to do trade with China, as it decouples in a sense or de-risks, it becomes a more attractive potential partner for India. So there is that looming in the background as always.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, James, what's your sense from the UK government side? Do they very much see India as a potential bulwark against China?
Yeah, I'm not sure they would necessarily be so explicit about the language, but I think that is a sort of the unspoken feature of a lot of conversations. Look, today we've had the Foreign Affairs Committee release a report. They're talking about different measures by which the UK can strengthen itself and sort of in that relationship against China. And I think, the obvious point here is that why couldn't India be built up and really try and develop this over those markets? So I was talking to one MP who made the point, for instance, why we got universities which are so financially dependent on Chinese students, replacing that with Indian students, students from a democracy seems like an obvious substitute which could help. Other things, for instance, looking at kind of ways to work with the Indian Navy in the future as well. So I think that obviously China is going to be the kind of key threat. Whether or not Rishi Sunak's ministers would actually say so explicitly or not remains to be seen. But it's going to be a key factor in the UK policy making for the 2020s, 2030s, and 40s. And interestingly, I think Labour actually at times have been even more Sino-sceptic on this issue than the Tories have. So I think that will continue after the next election. As Ravi says, I think that Modi will presumably will be re-elected next year, but Rishi Sunak doesn't look like it on current trends. So I think this is going to be a really long-term debate. What I would point to are the comments made by Britain's own man in New Delhi, Alex Ellis, the High Commissioner, and he gave a speech, I think it was 2 years ago, having also co-authored that Strategic Defence Review of 2021, which talked about the Indo-Pacific tilt. He said that in his lifetime, India, America and China will be the three great powers. And I think that really Britain is looking at the region and thinking, well, let's work what we can to work with India, which is still an ally, rather than basically make sure that China assumes a real hegemonic lead over this and dominates the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific region.
And James, you mentioned there the issue of student visas. There's probably something we should come back to, which is the wider issue of Indian visas when it comes to the trade deal. You mentioned that in your piece there's a potential sticking point on the British side. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we're now in the 13th round of negotiations on the free trade agreement between the UK and India. They started in January last year, so long time, but by kind of standards doing with India, some of the ones with Australia, I think, took on and off best part of a decade. So that's part of the course. And really it's been affected, first of all, by concerns politically with the Conservative Party here in the UK. So Boris Johnson and Liz Truss both wanted to get a deal done by Diwali. And that was seen as sort of weakening, I think, in the UK now, seen as weakening the UK negotiating hand, because if you have a deadline and say we're going to get there no matter what, what's the other incentive? What's the incentive for the other side to negotiate? So it's affected that part. But as you say, student visas has been an interesting part of this, which is that a lot of the Conservative Party are sceptical about high levels of migration. Kerry Badenoch, I think, said publicly last December that they didn't want any more student visas. And that's a key part of the conversation here, really, because the UK wants to reduce tariffs. I think that cited a stat in the article which says that only 3% of UK Indian goods to the UK have tariffs coming through, so just 3%, but vice versa, it's 60%. So they want those reduced tariffs, but at the same time that India is looking for things like visa concessions. So, for instance, on the fact that people who come have to pay national insurance and don't see the benefits of that, and also there's been discussions around student visas as well. So all those things have to be ironed out, and that's why I think, although I say that ministers are very keen to strike a deal with India, I can't see one necessarily being signed sort of imminently, and that's why I think that, as I tried to stress in the piece, is that as much as official ties are important and things like the free trade agreement, it's also unofficial ties as well, and the fact that British Indians are the largest ethnic minority group in this country with 1.8 million, and that's why unofficial ties are as likely to play a part in the future coming decades between Britain and India.
And Ravi, I'd be very interested to hear your view. What's the sort of Indian perspective on visa liberalisation? I mean, how important it is to Modi and his government that Britain allows more visas, for example, for Indian nationals in the UK?
It's really important. I think for quite a while now, India's tech sector has kind of cornered the market, not just in the UK, but around the world, in the US as well, for specialized visas. And what they often do is they send in workers on highly skilled visas to take on specific IT projects. So these are often short-term visas, anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. And if you look at most Western industrialized countries, those types of visas that are given out tend to be dominated by Indians. They also tend to get booked out almost as soon as they are up for grabs, such is the demand for them. And it's symbiotic, of course, because all of these Western economies, they do rely on companies that are based in India, such as, by the way, Infosys, which Prime Minister Sunak has a sort of stake in a sense, through his wife. But these companies have made huge inroads into the West, and they also have the ear of the Indian government. And so there's a fair bit of lobbying pressure in New Delhi to try and ensure that these companies are able to continue their growing their presence in countries like the UK and the US. And remember, these are highly weighted companies on the Bombay Stock Exchange. So of course there's a link back to the Indian private sector and general economic sentiment. And of course, I think for younger Indians, we can't overstate the importance of their mobility and their ability to go to other countries. It is very difficult to get a British visa, to get a work visa in the UK or the US if you're an Indian citizen. And so, New Delhi is very incentivized to try and make those processes easier, tie them into bigger deals as and when they can, so that they can push them through.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, James. Katy Balls says that Rishi Sunak needs to take some risks in a politics column this week. Is the PM's plan to stick to his 5 pledges going to win the public over? Katy joins me now. Katy, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, you write in your column this week that Rishi Sunak was looking for certain qualities in his next defence secretary. Now turns out that Ben Wallace is gone. He's been replaced by Grant Shapps. Do you think Grant Shapps has those qualities and he's up to the job more generally?
I mean, yeah, well, the qualities, there are about 4, but particularly it's non-flashy. I think Grant Shapps can try and be quite flashy sometimes. But the most important thing from the conversation I had, which I wrote about in the column, was this idea of someone who is loyal. And I think that Grant Shapps does tick that box. Because when they were picking the next defence secretary, it was ultimately suggesting someone hardworking, not particularly unique attributes. But I think if you read between the lines, you could obviously see a situation whereby I think what they were trying to say is you're not going to get a very showy person who's perhaps the type of candidate journalists might get more excited about, more dynamic, a bit more unpredictable. Instead, they were going to play it quite safe. And I think Grant Shapps does reflect that. A very experienced cabinet minister, lots of briefs. He is actually the shortest ever serving Home Secretary from his brief stint.
That's a great accolade.
That has got that under his belt, but was obviously served in lots of different Tory governments, of which we've had a couple at this point. And I think that, therefore, if you're looking at why they picked him, I mean, I think there's probably 2 main factors. I think the most important comes down to defence spending and the fact that they did not want to pick someone who might have, ideas about the defence budget, about the pledge at the next election, about what you do about the gaping holes in the current equipment the military has because so much has been sent to Ukraine. And if you think back to the summer leadership contest, Liz Truss was saying 3% of GDP for defence spending. Rishi Sunak would never go that high even in the contest. And when he took over from her, he scaled back down the defence spending. So at the moment, it's 2.5% of GDP is the target over a longer period of time. But I think they wanted to avoid the type of tussle you got. For example, if you think back to the Theresa May era, if we remember Private Pike, that was the nickname for Gavin Williamson when he embarked on this big, defence spending war with Philip Hammond. And therefore, Grant Shapps is very unlikely to do that. And then secondly, I think that the reason it is Grant Shapps and not another Sunak loyalist is because he's seen as a competent media performer. If we think back to the Boris Johnson era, he was the one who did the infamous Barnard Castle shift. When Dominic Cummings was caught in trouble, which was a pretty uncomfortable media rant, but I think it does just reflect how he is seen also by Rishi Sunak as someone you can send out and they will stick to the line. Now, of course, this does mean that perhaps you're getting a less dynamic defence secretary than some would say Ben Wallace was, and someone who was continually a Tory favourite. But that is clearly not what they decided to go for.
I mean, obvious comparisons in terms of resignations. We had Nadine Dorries not that long ago who released this scathing letter about the Prime Minister, and then you had Ben Wallace this week who's actually had quite an amicable departure. Do you think it's been handled quite well, his resignation?
Yeah, I think that behind the scenes there have been tensions between Ben Wallace and Rishi Sunak. Ben Wallace was very much a Boris Johnson man. He endorsed Liz Truss, not Rishi Sunak. And partly, I think, because of the difference in their defence spending pledges. But I think if you are loyal to Boris Johnson, you're often also a little bit sceptical of Rishi Sunak. You see that, not on the Doris level, but on a level. And I think the spending demands and the back and forth is something which did cause friction. I think there's also some in the MOD close to Ben Wallace who question why when you talk about the 5 priorities, nothing to do defence is in them. Because if you look at polling, for example, you have a situation whereby I think not every poll, but for example, there was a recent poll looking at, different policy areas. The only area where Labour were trusted less than the Tories was handling Ukraine. So why not make more something of it? But I think where we got to in the end is it has left on pretty amicable terms. If I think there are issues of defence spending in the past, I wouldn't rule out Ben Wallace coming out of the woodwork and making a statement. But I think it's gone probably as well as Rishi Sunak could have hoped for.
We should mention as well, Claire Coutinho has stepped into Grant Shapps' role as Secretary of State for Net Zero and Energy Security. What did you make of her appointment? Do you think it's a good choice?
Well, I think it's an interesting choice in the sense that she's the first of the 2019 intake to receive the high promotion to join the cabinet. I suppose for journalists, if we're looking from that perspective, it's probably a bit more interesting than Grant Shapps, just because it is a fresh face in the cabinet. And this is, again, a Sunak loyalist. I don't know if you can really get more loyal to Rishi Sunak than Claire Coutinho, in the sense that she served as PPS when she became an MP, but prior to that, she was actually his special advisor when he was in the Treasury. So they've known each other a very long time. She's a former banker. I think they think quite similarly on quite a few issues. And therefore, it's a big jump in terms of seniority on that brief. But I think having, a woman in her 30s on the energy brief at a time when net zero is just such a potentially divisive issue within the Tory party, Labour also, and the country, does suggest that I think, she is Treasury-minded in many ways, but she's also someone who has been a member of the Conservative Environment Network. So I think it's trying to ultimately appeal to, both sides there at that appointment.
So in some ways, a safe choice again. You write in your column this week that Rishi Sunak's very keen not to sort of go down the reset route and shake things up now. His party, though, is still 20 points behind in the polls. I mean, do you think that's the right strategy? What do you make of that?
So I think they hate the word reset because it tends to ultimately be an admission of failure previously. Why do you have to reset? It suggests, something went wrong of your own making. If you think about the various Boris Johnson resets, remember there being a big speech after he'd narrowly won a confidence vote. And a narrow win, a confidence, it's technically a win. It doesn't really feel like that when you have that many MPs against you. And the speech was a bit all over the place. And the MPs were a bit unsure, were messaging journalists saying more evidence. So I don't think they want to have an official reset for those reasons. I think there is the sense that the first stage of Rishi Sunak's premiership is coming to an end. So, coming in initially, trying to calm things down, both in terms of the economy, but also the Tory party, in all honesty. And therefore, if you do still have that big poll gap, what can you do to fill it? Now, you'll often hear members of Rishi Sunak's team say, it's going to be really radical, we're going to shake things up. And I think there's a question, which is Rishi's radical someone else's level of radical?
Yeah.
Or if in quite a risk-averse, logical politician, perhaps, I don't know if it's Dominic Cummings' levels of radical, but I think we are going to see, more attack. They're definitely sharpening up the political operation. I think there's an effort to bring back some old faces in terms of the Number 10 building. So you have One Aid coming back from the Cameron era. I think that during the Cameron era, that felt there was a really efficient attack operation. So to try and bring a bit more discipline in that sense. And lots more kind of going for Keir Starmer, I think his record from his time as DPP. And then you just have, these big set pieces that were always going to be there. So party conference, the King's speech and the autumn statement. And the question is, what can you do with them to suggest that this government, and the words of Nadine Dorries, is not a zombie government? And I think that's his challenge. But I could be wrong, but increasingly I think, Rishi Sunak's version of radical, I think we are going to see a different change of pace. It might be, as we've seen from the appointments that we just discussed, not as extreme as some in his party would like, given the state of things.
Home Secretary Suella Braverman this week told police to investigate every crime. Why weren't they doing this already, though? Is policing too focused on wishy-washy identity politics? Former prison governor Ian Acheson joins me now. Ian, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Suella Braverman has said this week that the police need to investigate every crime, and particular theft. What did you make of that announcement? Were you surprised to hear her say this? Or I guess a lot of people watching might be think that the police, were meant to be investigating every crime.
Well, you would think that, and thanks for having me on, Joel. You'd think that when you that the public would react like that, but I think the experience, unfortunately, of the public is that they realise that the police are not resourced or equipped, and sometimes don't have the will to investigate all crimes. Crimes have a disproportionate impact on people. So, my burglary might be an inconvenience to me. It might be devastating and life-changing to somebody who's got fewer resources, who's a repeat victim. So, I was interested in the Home Secretary coming out to say the police should investigate all crime. I was more interested, I guess, in the impertinence of the Police Chiefs Council, who then came out and tried to lecture her on not getting involved in operational matters. You'd think that, the political head of the Home Office would have every reason on behalf of citizens to make sure that the police are performing as the people who pay for them would expect.
Yeah, it's quite shocking. I mean, if you look at some of the stats around like the number of thefts investigated and solved, for example, it's pretty woeful stuff. I mean, do the police chiefs have any point? What's the reason these figures are so low, basically?
Well, I think there has been an environment where police chiefs have had to be put in a very invidious position. You know what the facts are as well as I do, and I've written about it for Coffee House enough. And that is, between 2010 and 17, austerity meant the police service across the country lost 22,000 officers. Those officers are only, quite recently being replaced, and there's a question about the type of officers that are replacing those who left. Meanwhile, you've got recorded crime at its highest level ever. I believe something like 7 million recorded crimes the last time the Office for National Statistics worked this out. So there is a mismatch in volume versus capacity with the police that will always be a factor about how much resource you can throw at something that isn't likely ever to be solved. But I think the net effect has been that it's been an excuse really for police to withdraw from communities and to withdraw from investigating certain types of crime that have a disproportionate impact on poorer communities. So what I mean by that is, where you have shops that are in poor areas that provide a vital community service, where shopkeepers are afraid to open up because of repeat offending, often by people who are shoplifting because of an addiction to drugs and so on. But where they see no response, it's so demoralizing for people who are providing that service that they decide to shut down. And that's not just your corner shop, is it? It's also, we've seen recently the Co-op saying that they're considering closing shops because there's been no response by the police to outrageous levels of theft from shops. And that's really dangerous, because I think when you see those communities that are under so much stress and pressure already, having services further withdrawn, you're into a bit of a death spiral. And of course, the one thing that we know, and we know from the United States, we know from the United Kingdom, is that the people who are disproportionately affected by reduction in police presence or police effectiveness are poor people. So, the people that live somewhere different to middle-class criminologists who, have dominated this debate for far too long. So I think we do need to get back to assertive police intervention, particularly in communities that have been denuded from neighbourhood policing. And this is another point, John, that I would say, that yes, there should be a focus, as bizarre as it sounds, where the Home Secretary is saying police investigate all crime. But where we have the decimation of neighbourhood policing, and where we have trusted and available and consistent police presences being withdrawn, because police chiefs again are put in a position where they have to produce an emergency service for life-threatening emergencies, but that has to be at the expense of something else. Where there's an abstraction of community and neighbourhood policing, you're getting these problems that are growing and growing with no solution to them until they, say they burst into the headlines. And the Co-op says, actually, we can't run a shop here because people are just, robbing the place blind, and the police aren't interested. So what we should have is a renaissance, in my opinion, of community policing. And again, I've written about this quite extensively, where the ground is taken back, where authority is restored in places where you normally only see a parking attendant, for God's sake, rather than a police officer. And problems that are driving some of, the lower level offences that don't seem to be investigated get addressed in a preventative way so that they don't get out of control. Because what we have to have in these communities are places where people feel that they are able to bring up families. And at the moment, I think in some of these communities, you get people who are stuck because they don't have the resources to move out. So we don't want these places that are suffering disproportionately from low-level crime, incivility and antisocial behaviour to be only thinking about moving out of them. We want to make them better for them. And I think, I would say to Michael Gove, who's the Levelling Up Secretary, that this issue is a levelling up priority. security of citizens to live in areas. He wants these areas to be livable spaces. Well, I think the police and crime control, particularly around low-level incivility and antisocial behaviour, is a key priority for him and his department to create these communities where people, can go out after dark.
But do you think the police need more resources to do this? Because, I imagine police forces would say, we would love to put more bobbies on the beat. We'd love to be out in the community much more. But at the moment, we're tackling very serious crimes and massive rise in sexual offences, for example. Do you sort of buy that? Do you think they need more money, more police officers than they have now? I know the numbers have been increased again, but do you think they need more than that?
I think we have to be very careful about a discourse that says we throw money at the problem and it will fix it. Because, look at the NHS, for example, which has got billions and billions invested in it, and it's still, in terms of productivity, way behind the curve where it should be. So, the policing numbers have been restored. That, to be fair to previous Home Secretaries and previous Prime Ministers, that was a pledge and has apparently been met. So this deficit of 22,000 police officers has been met. But I think culturally, something else is going on as well that speaks to leadership, because we don't have the same problem across all police constabularies. There are some constabularies that are outperforming others, where they've had very difficult, wicked problems to solve. Greater Manchester Police, for example, was in special measures, is now out of special measures because they've got a chief police officer, Stephen Watson, who wants to be focused on the priorities that matter to the public, not policing hearty words and nonsense like that. Nick Adderley in Northamptonshire also leads a force that is focused on delivering for the public. The bureaucratisation of the police, the sprawling bureaucracy of the College of Policing, who produce these lovely enormous tomes on how to detect crime better, when in fact the bureaucracy of the crime detection seems to be part of the problem as well. So it's not simply about leadership. I follow lots of police social media, Twitter accounts, X, whatever it's called. And it's really interesting when you look at the rhetoric of all this stuff, this guff, a lot of it that gets produced by bureaucracies that have been created at the top to try to support the front line, and what the reality looks like. I think what we have in constabularies that have the same resourcing, relatively speaking, but are doing much better, is a series of other things happening. You've got really good leadership. The second thing that you've got is a good connection between that leadership, that senior leadership, and frontline police officers and their supervisors, the sergeants, as it were, who've continuously been underinvested in. And they're the driving force of the policing response, sergeants and to a lesser extent inspectors. So where you have leadership that is focused on supporting the public and driving down crime and responding to the problems that the public are talking about, and you've got really good frontline supervision and highly motivated staff with the same resources, you can make a big difference. So there's a cultural issue that needs to be changed, as well as looking at the resource problem.
On that issue of culture, I wanted to ask you about the other sort of policing story in the news this week, which is that the head of the Met, Mark Rowley, has said that he doesn't want his officers taking the knee or supporting political causes anymore whilst they're on duty. Do you think that's the kind of thing, do you support that action?
Oh, absolutely. I do support that. I think the police have become mired in all sorts of distracting activities and virtue signalling that is almost antithetical to their Healean purpose, as it were, which is to solve crime and protect the public. Policing shouldn't be politicized. We've seen the damage that politicized policing can cause, across the board, including most recently in Northern Ireland, where junior police officers are thrown under the bus by a PSNI leadership that was cowed by Sinn Féin's demands for the scalps of these officers. So we need to take politics completely out of policing, and that includes identity politics. It includes all other forms of virtue signalling. We need to get back to basics, to use that infamous phrase, where the police are simply involved to protect the public and to solve crime. And it's a complex world. I do have sympathy when you're talking about, the highest level ever of police recorded crimes, 7 million crimes over the last recorded year. I don't underestimate the difficulty that chief officers have, but I find it very refreshing when you've got people like Stephen Watson coming to Greater Manchester Police, which was in special measures. I mean, in one case, because it was failing even to record crimes, let alone do anything about them, and basically grabbing that organisation by the scruff of the neck and saying, we're about getting out there and policing for people and solving the problems that people are concerned about. And people's concern about identity politics, I think, is very low on the register compared to their concern about crime and particularly antisocial behaviour and incivility, which is often the precursor in communities that have lost authority for much greater crimes. So people like that have my respect and support because they want to restore policing to the model that I've described.
And finally, Kate Andrews says that Brits don't see their GP enough. Is she right? Kate joins me now. Kate, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Hey, John.
You write in the magazine this week about the fact that Brits don't seem to want to go to the doctors. I mean, when did you first notice this was going on?
So I had this observation a very, very long time ago when it struck me that none of my friends, it wasn't simply that they weren't going to the GP for routine things. It was that when they were in serious pain, they were still avoiding the GP at all costs. I think I discovered this at university when I was at St. Andrews, which is well over a decade ago now. Just like that absolute refusal to go to the GP. And I thought, well, maybe it's just like a student thing and I'm maybe a bit weird that I might prioritize going to the doctor when I'm obviously sick and need medication. But then I discovered, no, at every single age group, this appears to be the case. And in our 20s, my friends would say, well, GP appointments are rare, they're rationed, we shouldn't be taking up that space. And then, you find yourself in the workforce, you find yourself meeting people from all different backgrounds, all walks of life at all ages. And you discover that people in their 60s and 70s are also avoiding the GP in theory to make space for others. So who's going? And my feeling is that this isn't simply about lack of access to treatment, although that's a very serious issue right now, and has been even before the pandemic. But I think there is a genuine aversion that Brits have to seeking out medical care. And I think actually in some respects, the pandemic has been an excuse for some people to, say, well, I simply can't go.
Sorry, because they don't like the doctors or they're worried about what?
They do not like the doctors. So there was some polling done in 2018. So again, long before the pandemic, that found that roughly 2/3 of Brits would put off medical appointments because they didn't want to get bad news. So a genuine sense of fear. And look, you can ask what came first, this nervousness or the NHS telling them not to show up. But, and I suppose this is kind of a vicious circle, but if you don't have a system that gives you preventative kinds of healthcare and really only sees you when you are very sick, well, then it's quite natural that you're afraid to go to the doctor because you are afraid to get bad news because things may have progressed past a point where maybe if you had caught it earlier, things would be slightly better. I list some examples in the piece of things that just absolutely baffle me. And I also point out this isn't, part of this is the American in me. I'm sure, Americans like to consume healthcare, but I think I have the rest of the world backing me up on this one too. I think Britain's neighbors, I think virtually all developed countries look at the UK and are baffled because on the one hand, everyone in the UK holds up universal access to healthcare as this crowning jewel of Britain, and yet its residents do everything they can to stay away from that so-called universal access.
I mean, you mentioned that this sort of affliction has even affected people in the office. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I have quite a few examples in the piece, all of which I got permission for, because they're all proud of this. Brits are proud of the fact that they don't go to the doctor. So they're like, yeah, I actually had a colleague be like, can you add me in? And I'm like, sure, okay, yeah, I'd love another crazy example. But one that I do point out is a colleague of ours and a good friend of mine had a bug bite. And I kept saying to her, you have to go get this checked out because it's getting worse. And eventually I sent her to my private GP because I was like, you just have to go get this seen immediately. And I should say the Spectator thankfully offers health insurance. So this is a realistic thing that I was able to say to her that certainly isn't true for everybody. And she went and she was hours away from potentially being hospitalized. It had got so bad and had become so infected. And I think it was widely agreed in the office and amongst our friends that she timed it perfectly. that is when she should have gone. And like, we had been having this conversation for a week, but as I say, I'll take the small win.
Oh, very good.
I'll take the small win. Maybe lessons could be learned down the line.
I would have to say as well, one thing that really blew my mind in your piece that really took me back was the fact that you said you tried to book in for a GP just for a health check.
Yeah.
Is that a normal thing in America to do?
It's a normal thing everywhere, John. It's a normal thing everywhere. The idea of going for a preventative check when you're healthy, like just to make sure that you are still healthy, that there aren't like little things you should be tackling now, so in 30 years they're dealt with. Just going once a year to get like a very quick little routine check is very normal in other countries, and like I feel in the UK it's a mind-blowing concept. And I mean, it is funny, it's also heartbreaking. I say in the piece, this horrifies me because I'm like, what are we going to discover in 10-15 years time? So it's, I don't know, I'm such a critic of the American system as well as the NHS. I've never been a fan of either. And I do point out the flaw in America, of course, is that they have some pretty terrible health outcomes compared to other developed countries. And that's often because people want to see a doctor but can't because they're afraid of the cost. And in this country these days, a lot of people struggle to see a doctor. But even before that, I just don't think a lot of people want to see a doctor. And so you end up getting you end up getting diagnoses that just come far later down the line and become a much bigger problem. These are all like very serious issues, but I can't help but like laugh and also cry at my friends when, in theory in the UK, the cost isn't supposed to be prohibitive, and yet people won't go.
As you know, it's pretty impossible to get a doctor's appointment at the moment. The health service is pretty much on its knees. Do you think the problem's going to get worse now?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's going to get worse. A lot of people who do want to see a doctor right now can't. And as I say in the piece, if you're lucky enough to get that GP appointment in a reasonable time frame, then you have the prospect of being added to a 7.6 million person waiting list on NHS England. You can understandably come to the conclusion, what's the point? And in this country, private healthcare is so expensive. There's no competitive system that that's just not going to be a realistic option for a lot of people. My fear, however, is that for others, this will essentially allow them to let their fear take over and say, well, I can't see one anyway, I'm not going to try. And as I said, this predates the pandemic. I think I noticed it pretty soon after I came to the UK as a student. Brits just don't want to go to the doctor. So I worry that it's kind of it's feeding that fear that they're still not going to go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thank you again for watching, and do join us again next week.